It's a good one to be ready for. That's the secret. Then I can forget, and everyone's like, "Oh, look, he knows stuff." And I'm like, "No, it's whatever. I don't know what I'm saying." But all right. Hello. All right. So we're gonna go ahead. Thyroid pathway. So, how does the thyroid get turned on? What does it make? And then what does that go do? Get you a little closer. All right. So thyroid hormone. This is our thyroid. Over here, we're going to have the brain representing the hypothalamus. Beneath the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary, anterior and posterior. We're going to be talking about the anterior today because it's the one that we care about for thyroid hormone. This is going to be a pretty quick video, which probably is how most videos should be anyway, so you'll probably enjoy it. All right. Hypothalamus is going to receive signals from the body, which can also be signals of perceived threat or anything like that. There's a lot of different signals that it will integrate. We're not going to go into those, but the hypothalamus is going to take all those together and say, do we need a higher metabolism rate right now or a lower metabolism rate right now? If it decides that it needs a higher metabolism rate, it also is heavily regulated by feedback from the hormones we're going to talk about. Those go back and feedback. So those are the two regulation pathways, integrative and feedback. All right, if we need to increase our metabolism rate, we're going to have TRH released from the hypothalamus. And that TRH is going to go down into the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary has something called a thyrotroph. It's a cell that makes a hormone that is called a thyroid stimulating hormone. And when thyroid releasing hormone comes down from the hypothalamus and pokes the thyrotroph, it will dump all of its it'll dump some of its thyroid stimulating hormone into the bloodstream where it will be carried to the thyroid. The thyroid has a receptor that will grab it. TSH is grabbed and it will open a transporter called the sodium, that's an N for sodium, iodine symporter, or NIS for short. So thyroid stimulating hormone binds, that causes NIS to open. NIS, the sodium iodine symporter, is going to move in sodium and iodine into the thyroid. Sodium and iodine come in, and elevated levels of iodine will activate pendrin, a molecule that is going to interact with an enzyme called TPO, thyroperoxidase. So pendrin, turning on thyroperoxidase, is then going to allow all the iodine that came in to be attached to the hormone base that has been waiting around. So a thyroglobulin protein has been waiting around for iodine to be attached to it, and pendrin will turn on TPO, so the TPO can take all that new iodine that just came in and attach it to the thyroglobulin. And so each of those iodines is going to add a number to our designation of thyroglobulin. So it goes from T0 with no iodines to T1 to T2 to T3 to T4. T4 is what we usually will be releasing from the thyroid. And that would be released into the blood. Now, before we continue, there are two places in the thyroid that we want to talk about. There are the normal thyrocytes, so cells of the thyroid. And then there are the in cells. So here's a bunch of cells. And then in the middle of those cells, there's a place where there is no cell. And it's just a space. That is called the colloid space, where all the cells are either called thyrocytes or follicular cells. Thyrocytes means any thyroid cell. Follicular thyroid cells are a specific type of thyroid cell. Thyrocytes, moving. All right. So the TPO is on the edge of the cell. So it would be right here. And when it is firing the iodine onto the protein, that is going to be made and stored. The iodine is going to be attached, I should say. Most of the prep happens in the cell, but the iodine will be attached in the colloid space, and that's where you'll store your thyroid hormone until you release it. Make sense? with the 2 brain cells we have left to rub together,
Yeah.
1 from me and 1 from you, 3. All right. Awesome. So that's thyroid story. Step 1, TSH arrives. Step 2, that opens the sodium iodine symporter, and then iodine and sodium come in. Step 3, pendrin is turned on because of the iodine levels going up. Pendrin, step 4, pendrin turns on TPO, which blasts iodine onto the thyroglobulin. So step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. And then you have it made and stored in the colloid. After you have it made, let's say that somewhere in the body it wants it. And so thyroid stimulating hormone also causes you to release some. So you release it and you make more. And so it's doing both of those. So you're going to go ahead and release some T4. And T4 is going to travel through the blood to pretty much every cell in the body. Because every cell in the body has a metabolism rate, how fast it works or how slow it works. The more T4 it gets, the more thyroid hormone in general it gets, the faster it will break down sugar and the faster it will do all of its work. So T4 is going to come to any cell in the body, and there's a transporter that lets it come inside, and then T4 hangs out inside until the cell decides to break it down. And it does break it down into T3, so it pops 1 iodine off. The enzyme that does that is appropriately named. It is called deiodinase, because it is D, removing, taking off, and iodine, iodinase. It does this because T4 is just a storage form. It actually doesn't do very much to the cell, very little. And so the active form that actually works for the cell really well is T3. Now, you might ask, why does the thyroid send out an inactive form? Part of the reason is because each cell that receives T4 can break it down to T3 at a rate that it specifically needs for itself. However, this regulation isn't perfect, and so if you get a frick ton of T4 inside of your cells, they will, if they have too much of it, then the enzyme deiodinase is going to break stuff down whenever it bumps into it. So if you have a lot there, and the cell, you can get hyperthyroid by having too much T4. The deiodinase is not going to regulate perfectly how much metabolism boost you get. So, other things that you should know about this. There's something called reverse T3. So let's go ahead and draw a big protein. Thyroglobulin, 4 iodines. That's T4. If we take off this iodine, it would be T3. But if we take off this iodine, which happens sometimes by accident when the deiodinase is slightly mutated or makes an accident, or maybe the T4 is slightly mutated or something along those lines. There are various reasons. You take off the wrong iodine, and now it's T3 because it only has 3 iodines, but it's not the same T3. So we call it reverse T3 because it's like a mirror image of what it should be. And I think I erased the wrong iodine, and it's supposed to be that one. So it's the other on the same side, but the opposite hemisphere, if you will. Reverse T3 is pretty much useless. Doesn't do anything. And so when you're trying to get energy and trying to elevate your metabolism, T3, reverse T3 is not going to help you. So if you end up having a problem where you make a lot of reverse T3 and not very much T3, that's going to cause hypothyroid. A couple other problems you can come across besides reverse T3 are when you have ridiculously high iodine intake. If you have a lot of iodine, then the thyroid is going to get more iodine than it really should. And that's going to make so that you make more T3 and T4, and eventually you're going to have it moving enough that you're going to have a feedback loop where the thyroid hormone is going to come back and say, yo, we have enough, please turn off everything. And you actually end up with hypothyroid because the feedback loop is strong enough. I'm drawing a whole bunch of arrows. Instead of trying to follow the arrows, think of it this way. Every hormone that we've talked about turns off the hormone before it. And the hormones before it. So T4 can turn off TSH and TRH. TSH can turn off TRH. And so it just, all the guys before it can turn them off. And so if you have a lot of iodine, you're going to end up making a whole bunch of stuff, and then you'll have a negative feedback to try and tamp it down, and it tends to overreact in this case. And so then you can end up hypothyroid because you had a lot of iodine. There's more to it than this, but that's how far we'll go right now. If you have too little iodine, you can also have hypothyroid. And this one kind of makes sense. If you don't have the iodine to make your T4, then you're not going to have thyroid hormone. So we talked about 3 diseases. We talked about iodine being too high or too low, which can lead to hypo or hypo. So it's hypo both ways. And then we talked about reverse T3. And we'll talk about one more. If you have iodine that is just a little low, not a lot, iodine that's just a little low. So there's one disease, there's 2, there's a third one. Just a little low, then you might have enough for it to just do this. And you, instead of making T4 in the thyroid, you make T3. And that means you're going to be sending out T3, and you're going to have hyperthyroidism for a little while, and usually that eventually ends up being hypothyroidism after the initial boost of T3 that goes on for a short period of time. Short period of time meaning days or weeks. And so if your iodine is low, you can only make T3 with the thyroid, and it's like, well, looks good to me. I mean, it's better than nothing. Sends it out. And then these guys can't choose when to activate it. It just comes in active. Okay, so if I were to review this myself, I would first do hypothalamus and pituitary story. Then I'd do thyroid story, including the cells. And then I would do diseases. Those are the 3 chunks. And
you don't have any diseases.
Diseases were these 3. So iodine being too high or too low both leads to hypothyroidism, which is a disease. It's not the way we often think about disease because it's like there's no autoimmune issue. I mean, you can eventually have autoimmune that messes with this a lot too, but I don't think we talked about those.
Then you get the low iodine, which can go straight to the T3, and then
right.
T3 in the foot.
Yeah.
And then cause hyper, and then we go back into hypo.
Right. So this one would do hyper at first, and then it would lead to hypo. And then reverse T3 is just when you're really not converting it right, and it's its own thing.
Now, what is the colloid come from? It's just the
Colloid.
colloid?
So colloid is the space in between all the thyrocytes, and there's no cell there. It's just fluid, and it just has all the thyroid hormone resting in there until the body requests it.
It's fluid, and then cells are bound to the thyrocytes. And they come
Correct.
from the FSH?
Um,
Or no, is that what that's for? What's
the
colloid?
FSH?
Or follicular?
Follicular cells is just another name for these cells that make the thyroid hormone. They are follicular cells. They are also called thyrocytes. Thyrocytes means any cell in the thyroid. Follicular cells means these ones in particular.
And then the number 2, what is that abbreviation of? Is that an N?
That's an NIS. Sodium, because sodium, if you do it in its abbreviation, it's Na. And so that's where they get the N. And then the I is iodine. And then the S is symporter. So NIS, or sodium iodine symporter. And that's the gateway that you let iodine into the thyroid from. It's turned on by TSH, or opened by TSH.
And since it's a symporter, it is going with this gradient, but using a, or is active?
They're both moving in the same direction.
Okay. And it is going to reach the.
All right, we'll just hit the pathway really quick. TSH coming from the pituitary is going to turn on the sodium iodine transporter, sodium iodine symporter. That gateway opens and iodine and sodium come in. Iodine and sodium go ahead and are sensed by the pendrin. Pendrin's like, we have iodine. Let's do the iodine thing. And pendrin goes to turn on TPO, thyroperoxidase, TPO. TPO will then blast some iodine onto the thyroglobulin that's floating around in the colloid space, and it'll go ahead and attach it. And puts 4 on all of them when it's working properly, and then it's done. You have T4 resting in the colloid space. I have a little fun thing to remember this pathway. You may as well, since we're basically done. So TSH, I just remembered, but for people who like Arthur, King Arthur, there's the Wizard of Nis, and then there's Pendrin, like Arthur Pendragon. So there's a wizard, and then he waves at Arthur Pendragon on the hill. And then Arthur Pendragon has a TPO, which reminds me of POW, like a cannon. The O reminds me of the cannon's mouth, and that blasts the iodine onto the dragon, which is the floating thyroglobulin, which I just make look like a dragon. So, Pendrin, I had to do a King Arthur thing. Maybe I. So, that's thyroid for Phys. He probably also mentioned Hashimoto's and some other diseases like that. Make sure that you touch on those. I'm going to leave those for review where you can look at them. Hashimoto's and Graves' disease. I will say this much. Graves is hyperthyroid. Because of autoimmune, this is an antibody, not the letter Y, this is an antibody that is attacking, this is an antibody, not the letter Y, this is an antibody that is attacking the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor on the thyroid. So this thing right here, if you have an antibody always turning it on, you're always letting iodine in, and you're always making thyroid hormone. And that leads to hyperthyroid. Graves is the one where you have bulging eyes, and you are, hyperthyroid. Your metabolism is through the roof. Hashimoto's is hypothyroid. It is also autoimmune, which is what this is, an antibody. And it goes against, if I recall correctly, the sodium iodine symporter. And so the doorway is held closed all the time. And so even if thyroid stimulating hormone comes and says, open that door, you've got a big fat antibody over it. And you let in virtually no iodine. And that means you can't make nothing. So they are both autoimmune. One is versus the TSH receptor. One is versus the NIS transporter. that's probably that's probably about what he covers in the slides. See if there are any other details. And I will say this, just so that you know, clinically speaking, there are other forms of Graves and Hashimoto's, because the autoimmune thing can go against a variety of targets. These are examples. It is possible, for example, to have the antibody bind, if I recall correctly, I haven't reviewed this recently, but as I recall, it can bind the TSH receptor in a way that doesn't turn it on, and then it's just sitting there covering it. And then that would lead to Hashimoto's like symptoms. And so that would just be another way you can have Hashimoto's, is it's covering up a receptor so you can't turn it on. And things like that. You can have the door held open. And so, but the way that it usually works is the way that is taught right here. Okay. So hyperthyroid, you're turning on the TSH receptor all the time. Hypothyroid, you're blocking the door. All right, any questions before we tie up?
Yeah. Thyroid releasing hormone is going to send a message to the
Anterior pituitary, and then the back one's the posterior. So it will go to the anterior pituitary. And there's thyrotropes. Oh, look, I wrote right there. Yeah, thyrotrope. So the anterior pituitary has a thyrotrope in it, which makes and holds on to TSH until TRH tells it to dump it out and make some more. Good question.
And then it just goes through the bloodstream and goes straight to the receptor, or ligand. Or is that a ligand?
The receptor.
Receptor. So TSH is it's a ligand.
Yep. So the TSH would be the ligand, and then it goes to the receptor. You got it. All right.
I think I got it.
Schwente. All right.
Well, no, I don't have it.
Okay.
Because
One more.
It's so funny because if it's inducing the conformational change by the ligand, why does it need the door?
Because the conformational change is opening the door.
Oh,
That
it's
is
supposed
what
to open
changes.
the door. Okay, that's what I'm thinking. See, I'm like, it's two of one type of
Cheers.
It's like,
It is.